Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here, and we're going to kind of go over section three. We're getting closer to getting done with this chapter. The thing about we're going to talk about, we're still in the 1920s. We're still talking about the era, but we're talking about education and popular culture, getting into a little bit. So during the 1920s, we see that education and mass media become a little bit more of an impact in the nation. Primarily, a part of that has to do with that resources are available now, also the need for education. And also, a big part is kids ain't getting jobs. Okay. It used to be that children would get jobs back in the late 1800s or throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s. Kids were working. The child labor was cheap, and kids, most kids didn't go to get an education, so they're out getting jobs. And things change after World War One. In 1914, approximately 1 million American students were actually attending high school. So not a lot of kids were going to school. I think the most that maybe students were getting is up till sixth grade. But by 1926, we see that number has risen to nearly 4 million. So that's your answer number eight, by the way. We see this sparked by prosperous times and higher education standards for industrial jobs. So prior to the 1920s, we see that high schools had catered to college-bound students. In contrast, high schools of the 1920s started to offer a broad range of courses, vocational training, interested in industrial jobs. So the idea was, because what was happening after World War One was, if you remember, women were taking those jobs because the men were off to war. Well, some of those men come back, and it's like, hey, sorry, ladies, we got to get these jobs to men. So then, any other available jobs that were clerical jobs, jobs that required, some more sophisticated tasks, those were then given to women. So there was no jobs for children, and so we see that a lot of states are going to decide, okay, we got to do something with these kids. They can't just be on the streets. They can't be messing around. We need to get them somewhere, and that was education. Education was the idea, and provide education that's more than just, hey, go to college. No, let's train these individuals to grow up and be electricians, or let's train these individuals to grow up and be a plumber. And these are tasks that should not, there's nothing wrong with being a plumber. There's nothing wrong with being an electrician. There's some pretty well paying jobs. I'm gonna be honest with you. If I'm a kid right now, and I know that I'm not putting up the numbers to go to college, I'm considering certain vocational avenues out there because we're seeing that there are a lot of plumbers, electricians, mechanics, and certain just blue collar type jobs are going down. The numbers are going down. We have more kids trying to get college degrees than trying to replace some of these jobs, these more needed industrial jobs, these or service jobs, because those jobs matter. We need a plumber. You got to call a plumber, and I would rather have more qualified plumbers out there than just a select few number. So anyway, so we start to see that the public schools met another challenge in the 1920s, teaching children of immigrant families. This obviously is kind of hard and difficult because we notice a lot of these immigrants come in and they don't speak the language, and also a lot of them are illiterate, and this becomes a bit of a challenge moving forward. But unlike the earlier English and Irish immigrants, we do see that speaking English was going to be a bit of a challenge. By the 1920s, their children filled these cities' classrooms. Teachers are determined to take on this challenge. Taxes to finance schools increased during this time. Schools' costs had to double in 1913 and 1920, and then double again in 1926. Now we're seeing states are actually spending more money on these resources, on these things, but it is going to be problematic because what are we going to do? Where do we spend it? Who gets priority? That's going to always be a question, a problem. The total cost of American education in the mid-1920s was around $2.7 billion a year. Answer number 9 is right down here, reader digest and time. Widespread education, increased literacy. We do see growing mass media help shape the culture as well. Um, look, schools helped with the literacy, but I would say the biggest thing that helped with literacy was media, and one of the biggest things was the magazine. Now, newspaper circulation rose with writers learned how to hook readers by imitating sensational stories and tabloids. Big bolded headlines like, oil company robs the people, and so people are going, whoa, how's an oil company robbing us, and so then they kind of have to read into that. By 1914, about 600 local papers had shut down and 230 had been swallowed by huge national chains, giving more readers more expansive coverage from the big cities. We do see that, yes, local papers were slowly dying at this time. Only a few of the bigger local papers survived, but we do see big city chains are buying up some of these brands, and they're using it as an opportunity to get their stories out. So we see that the mass circulation magazines also flourished during the 1920s. We see the magazines summarize the week's news, both foreign and domestic. So we see that magazines in the past used to be mostly just big, one huge, just a big book of extensive coverage of one story or a few stories. But now we see that these magazines are covering each week, the week's news. By the end of the 1920s, we see 10 American magazines, including Reader's Digest. Excuse me. Founded in 1922, and Time, founded in 1923, boasted a circulation over 2 million each. So this is your answer. Answer number 13 is down here with World Series. Also, the biggest thing wasn't just the newspapers covered the weekly news. They also covered cultural events. They started to, and the other thing, too, is what also helps is you see that radio comes in, and it's also, too, covering more than just news. Radio is probably the most powerful communication to that of the newspaper and magazines. Not that newspaper magazines weren't great, and more people are learning how to read and picking up magazines and newspapers. But really, it's radio that changes the game, that gives people more of an opportunity to hear what's going on around the world, because also the airwaves that are happening are carrying throughout across the seas and across the nation, and people are able to pick it up on the radio. So, and a lot of these terms like airwaves and radio audience and tune in started becoming part of everyday speech. And airwaves are basically is that you have your transmitters and in the radio station that transmit the sound to these wires to then a tower, which then carries an airwave, which that airwave carries that sound to another tower, to another tower, to another tower, to another tower. And as more and more towers are popping up throughout the nation, those airwaves are carrying across the country a lot stronger. And we also notice, like with AM radio has some pretty strong airwaves. And we see that early on, AM radio was the radio sequence that carries this. And so building in what we call the radio audience and then tuning in to certain shows and news programs. But we see by the end of the decade, radio networks started to really flourish in the United States, and we see that they're really growing in this time. And then we see that the wider world had opened up to Americans who could hear the voice of the president finally for this time, and then finally listen to the World Series live. It used to be, it's kind of like Twitter today. Sometimes I forget to watch my favorite sports team, or sometimes I don't get a game on my channel. For example, I'm not saying I'm cheap, but I just don't want to spend the money on was it the NFL Pass to get all the NFL games. So, but I do like fantasy football, so I only get the 4 games each Sunday. And so, So other games I don't get. So how do I follow that news and saw them some of those highlights? Well, Twitter. Twitter opens that door up. Of me going, oh, I could see the pictures and I could see the score, the updates. It does a good job of updating me on my sports, and so it's kind of like that back in the day. A lot of these individuals, when they wanted to know more about the sporting event, they would have to pick up a paper the next day and read all the highlights and stories about the game, and that was their only way of understanding who won and what happened. And but the radio opens up a broader sense of, oh, not only can I find out what's going on, but I can find out what's going on now, and that they can tune into to some of their sporting events. Not all, but a few of them, like the World Series, which that was a big deal. It was great to listen to it live than read about it the next day. During the 1920s, we see that also a lot of other leisure is starting to be popularized. By the way, your definition of Babe Ruth is down here in the blue, home run slugger. So during the 1920s, many people had money and the leisure time to enjoy it. In 1929, Americans spent $4.5 billion on entertainment, much of it on ever-changing fads. We see that the decade opens up an opportunity for people to spend money. With more and more people getting jobs, especially women, this is now giving them the chance to not just hold on to money, to actually spend it. We see early in the decade, Americans engaged in new leisure pastimes such as working crossword puzzles, playing certain games. But in 1922, they are now being able to use their money outward and go to places and do things. In 1922, King Tut, the Egyptian pharaoh, was making the rounds throughout the United States, showing off people. They were showing off his jewelry, his luxury, and so people were spending money to go see the young pharaoh. And also, we're seeing that other things, money is allowing them to do is go spend out time, hanging out, going to clubs, dancing. So giving the opportunity, or go see a sporting event. More and more people are flooding the baseball games, watching people, especially in New York, you're watching Babe Ruth, the home run slugger. So we start to see that, money is being spent in the 1920s. We see that, the part of the reason also too is corporations started to realize, look, if the United States government is not going to implement a rule that says, hey, you can only have your employees work a certain number of hours each week, we're going to do it ourselves. Like Henry Ford, part of the reason why he did not let his people work on Saturdays is because he wanted them to go out and buy a Ford. He's making all these Fords and his employees aren't driving them. Why? Because they're not able to go out and spend the money to do so, because they're working basically Monday just through Saturday, and then the only day off they have is Sunday for church. And so he's like, hey, get out there on Saturday and buy a Ford. And that's kind of the idea he was thinking. And also others like him were thinking is like, look, we need to let our people go and have a day off and start the weekend after Friday night shift or Friday shift, and then, enjoy the rest of your weekend, see you on Monday. And that the idea was to get people out to spend their money. Another thing that was going on in the 1920s is Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh had some success in flying across the Atlantic. He made the first nonstop solo flight across the Atlantic. Your definition is there in blue. Your answer number 10 is Paris down here, by the way. Pretty good looking guy from Minnesota. Lindbergh was. He was going after a $25,000 prize offered the first nonstop solo transatlantic flight. Basically, May 20th, 1927, he took off from New York City from the Spirit of St. Louis, flew it to the coast of Newfoundland, and then headed over to over the Atlantic. And then after 33 hours and 29 minutes, Lindbergh landed just outside of Paris and was crowded or surrounded by a crowd that was enthusiastic to see him land in Paris. And they threw a big party for him. New York showered Lindbergh with ticker tape, the confetti and all that stuff. And everybody was so happy with him. And he became an American Idol. He was and then we see that, a lot of sensationalism, excess and crime. In the age of sensationalism, excess, and crime, Lindbergh kind of stood up as this honest, brave guy who who really just was wanting to bring some joy to America. The novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, a fellow Minnesotan, also caught the essence of Lindbergh's fame, and Lindbergh's accomplishment paved the way for others. In this new decade, we see even Amelia Earhart, who would have some success flying airplanes until her tragedy where she had gone missing. Your answer number 11 is talkies, by the way. Also, another big thing that's happening during this time, I kind of went a little too far, is we see filmmaking really starts to take off in the 1920s. It had really taken off even in the late 1800s. We see that people like Edison had caught on to what was going on in Europe. The inventions of the motion picture camera, and we're seeing Edison is creating his own. And we see a lot of silent films were very popular in the early 1900s. And we start to see that the silent film was drawing in crowds and people wanting to watch this new technology of a camera that could capture movement. And so even before the introduction of sound, movies became the national pastime, offering viewers a means to escape through the romance and comedy. But people wanted to know, is there a way to insert sound into these films? Because in order to get sound, you had to be there in person to watch it. They would have a piano playing the music. They may have some sound effects live in person, but never in the film or through the audio itself. And even dialogue was, they had little, written dialogue that the frames that they would show in between the scenes to kind of understand what's going on. So, but we see that eventually Don Juan in the 1920s and then the Jazz Singer incorporate sound into their movies. So they're able to figure out the little film strips could carry sound. And then the Jazz Singer actually, and by mistake, actually carries the first sound dialogue ever casted in a film. And then if we see Walt Disney's Steamboat Willie does the same, capturing the first animated sound, released in 1928. And this opens the door what is called talkies. Instead of being silent films, by the 1930s, we now have films called talkies, which had double movie attendance with millions of Americans going to the movies every week. Both playwrights and composers of music broke away from Europe traditions of the 1920s to do these things. And it opens up the door for new actors. Sadly, some of the great silent film actors don't quite get to work in the talkies. They didn't quite have the voice for it. It's very true. But it did happen during that time. And the thing is, movies weren't just the only thing that were, popular and starting to gain a lot of steam. We also see plays and other art forms are making a way to success. Eugene O'Neill's plays, such as The Hairy Ape, forced Americans to reflect upon the modern isolationism, Confucianism, family conflict. Fame was given to more Jewish composer George Gershwin, who made popular American jazz. We also see painters as well in America getting some love. Edward Hopper and some of his work, his canvases, as well as George O'Keeffe and his work with the New York landscape. So these are all kind of growing in popularity. Your definition for F. Scott Fitzgerald is that he wrote The Great Gatsby, and he's also number 12. But also writers are starting to really get noticed in this time. And we see Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win the Nobel Prize, among the era's most outspoken critics. In his novel, The Babbitt, Lewis is used the main character, George F. Babbitt, to ridicule Americans for their conformity and materialism. Mostly kind of attacking, going after the idea that, hey, let's just accept the way things are. Things are fun. Things are great. We have a lot more money now. Let's go spend it. There's a lot of carelessness. Even some of this is even written in F. Scott Fitzgerald's, novels. He coined the term the Jazz Age, referring to the 1920s. It was the Jazz Age. Jazz is free flowing and fun in its music. But it also has its moments of, damper down moments, like not everything is free flowing and fun in jazz. And that's where kind of the blues comes in. That's how our blues is more famous. It's more the more depressing forms of jazz. But jazz was free flowing and fun. And that's kind of what the era was. People were kind of being reckless. They weren't thinking about, all these great technologies are out there and I've got money to spend on it, instead of, storing that money away, which we'll talk more later on. But in this side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby, we see Fitzgerald reveal the negative side of the period's gaiety and freedom, portraying wealthy and attractive people leading imperiled lives in the gilded surroundings. Especially Great Gatsby, which when you guys are juniors, you'll be able to enjoy that novel. And you can, after you read the novel, watch the movie, the Leo version, because it's really good. But that really hits on the age. I mean, you have a Gatsby character who's mysterious and dark, um, and there's a lot of references that of him maybe fighting in World War One and him coming back. How did he become so famous? How did he get all this money? So definitely a lot of focus on him as an individual, and how he is this individual who is not afraid to flaunt his money and his success. But there's still a lot of people going like, okay, who really is this Gatsby character, and why is he continuing to throw all these lavish parties? And then it kind of goes deep into that Gatsby on the outside looks to be more of like this, he's got everything figured out, but then really on the inside, there's a lot more brokenness and a lot of just things he hasn't figured out. And it definitely the people around there, in that time that they showcase in the novel, it's very much this theme of, just kind of going, look, we don't, we're not really thinking about our actions. We're just enjoying the moments, but then there are consequences to those actions. And that's where the book kind of goes into. The people weren't taking things seriously. Edna St. Vincent Millay is down here, your definition. So New York City is brilliant, had a brilliant group of writers. Many of them kind of formed this at the Algonquin Hotel's Roundtable. We see best known as Dorothy Parker, wrote poetry during this time. Also, we see many writers also met on important issues head on. The Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton dramatized the clash between traditional and modern values and had undermined high society 50 years earlier. Willa Cather celebrated the simple, dignified lives of people such as the immigrant farmers in Nebraska in her book. And then also Edna St. Vincent Millay, who wrote poems celebrating youth and life of independence and freedom from the traditional constraints. So some of these writers like Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos were soured by American culture, and decided to go to Europe and really spend time in Paris. And this was known as the Lost Generation because they had success in America, and then they left and went over to Europe, and they joined other American writers already in Europe, and such as poets like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, whose poem "The Wasteland" presented an agonized view of society and seemed stripped of humanity. I think a lot of the reason why these writers left America to go to Europe is because they were seeing the writing on the wall that the party is going to crash. At some point, you can't keep partying. At some point, you have to realize there's an end point. And they realized that endpoint was going to be very dangerous. So I think a lot of them went to Europe. It was a little bit more leveled, headed at the time, even though there are signs leading to war. So several writers saw the action in World War I, and early books denounced war. Dos Passos' novel "The Soldiers." The novel "The Three Soldiers" attacked war as a machine designed to crush human freedom. The Sun also rises and Pharaoh to Arms also criticized the glorification of war. You're seeing that World War I definitely left a mark on people. They knew how bad it was, and they do not want it to happen again. We're going to talk obviously later on that yes, everybody didn't want World War I to happen again, which would be World War II. But the problem is they did not want to hold people accountable. And because they did not hold them accountable or strike at the right time or make the right decisions, it led to a World War II. And that's something we'll talk about later on as we approach World War II after the Great Depression. But That's something that we'll definitely have to address. But Americans of the 1920s, really, this moment is just basically showcasing their successes, their pride, their talents, and we see not just white artists, but also black artists were celebrated for their richness and talent. And we're going to talk about the African American culture with the Harlem Renaissance. So we'll definitely cover that into the next chapter. I'll see you guys. Have a good one.